This move immediately claims central space and opens lines for the queen and king's bishop, setting the stage for aggressive attacking play or solid positional development. This move, 1. G6, initiates a fianchetto setup, aiming to control the long diagonal with the bishop, a hallmark of hypermodern defenses like the King's Indian or modern defense, prioritizing piece play and positional pressure over immediate central pawn occupation. By advancing the d-pawn, White establishes central control and opens lines for their pieces, aiming to develop actively in the spirit of classical opening principles. This move develops the bishop to its best diagonal, directly challenging White's central pawn control and preparing for fianchetto development. This develops the knight to a central square, controls key squares like d5 and e5, and prepares for kingside castling, a standard continuation in many Indian defenses. This move solidifies the pawn center and prepares to develop the knight to its natural square, aiming to control key central squares and support a flexible pawn structure. This move develops a knight to a central square and prepares to castle, supporting the d4 pawn and controlling key squares in the center, typical in many main lines of the King's Indian defense. Developing the knight to f6 follows standard opening principles, reinforcing the center and preparing for kingside castling while indirectly challenging White's central pawn structure. Developing the bishop to e2 supports kingside castling and prepares to connect the rooks, a standard continuation in this King's Indian defense setup. This move firmly establishes your king's safety and prepares for development of your remaining pieces, a standard and solid response within the King's Indian defense framework. Castling kingside completes the development of the minor pieces and king's safety, preparing to join the central struggle and potentially launch a kingside attack. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, aiming to pressure White's central pawn structure and potentially create tactical opportunities by pinning the knight. This move prepares to challenge Black's bishop on g4, potentially forcing it to retreat or be exchanged, while also supporting the central pawn on d4 and freeing the queen. Developing the knight to its natural outpost solidifies the center and prepares to contest control of the d4 square, a key strategic battleground in this variation of the King's Indian defense. This move prepares to connect the rooks after castling and potentially supports a kingside pawn advance or a queenside maneuver, creating flexibility in White's development. This move 8, e5 is a bold central break, challenging White's pawn center and aiming to open lines for Black's pieces, though it must be carefully calculated to avoid weaknesses. This pawn advance, 9, d5, strategically gains space in the center and restricts Black's knight on c6, aiming to solidify White's central control and prepare for further kingside expansion. This move prepares to reroute the knight to f5 to increase pressure on White's kingside, a common strategy in this King's Indian defense setup. By bringing the rook to the d-file, White prepares to potentially contest the open file and support a future pawn advance with c2-c4, aiming to restrict Black's pieces. This move prophylactically shifts the king from the g-file, anticipating potential pawn breaks or piece activity along that line, and also clears the f8 square for a potential piece repositioning. This move aims to dislodge or neutralize Black's bishop on g4, which is currently exerting pressure along the e6-4 diagonal and potentially hindering White's queenside development or central expansion. This move resolves Black's central tension by removing a key White defender of the d4 pawn, opening the e-file for potential piece activity and forcing White to recapture potentially disrupting their pawn structure or developing a less active piece. White recaptures the bishop, solidifying the pawn center and opening the f-file for potential central pressure and piece activity. This move repositions the knight to a more flexible square, preparing to potentially support a d5 pawn advance or redeploy to c5 for greater activity. This move aims to redeploy the bishop to a more active square on the kingside, preparing to support a potential kingside pawn storm or to contest the dark squares if black attempts to challenge white's central control. This move initiates a pawn break in the center, challenging white's central control and aiming to open lines for black's pieces, particularly the kingside knight and potentially the f-file. This pawn thrust aggressively challenges black's kingside pawn chain and opens lines for white's pieces, though it also creates potential weaknesses. Black initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to create weaknesses in white's pawn structure and open lines for attacking play, while white must carefully defend against the aggressive advance. This pawn capture opens the f-file for your rook and creates a passed pawn on g5, initiating a critical battle for control of the center and queenside initiative. This pawn push sacrifices material to open the f-file and create attacking chances against white's kingside, a common thematic idea when facing a fianchettoed bishop. The move bf2 aims to defend the e3 square and prepare for potential knight repositioning to f3, while also offering a trade of bishops to alleviate white's slightly cramped position. The move 16, h6 aims to immediately challenge white's bishop on f2 and potentially create a weakness on the kingside, though it opens lines for white's pieces and risks weakening black's own king's safety. This capture opens the g-file and initiates a critical pawn confrontation, aiming to exploit the exposed black king by trading off defenders. The recapture of the bishop on h6 aims to solidify black's pawn structure on the kingside and prepare for further central play, although it does open the g-file for white's rook. This move re-centralizes the bishop to a more active square, aiming to pressure black's weak kingside pawn structure and prepare for further central play or attacks along the dark squares. This move develops the knight to a more active central square, preparing to contest white's central pawn majority and potentially target the weak f-pawn. This move is a repositioning of the queen to a more active square, supporting a potential kingside advance and preparing to contest the central files while keeping an eye on the pinned knight. This move repositions the rook to the g-file, preparing to challenge white's control of the open g-file and potentially create tactical threats against white's king or pawns. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting a potential kingside pawn push and exerting pressure on black's queenside. The move 20, rg7 aims to reposition the rook from the somewhat awkward g8 square to a more active diagonal, potentially supporting a central advance or defending the kingside. This move is a prudent king repositioning, vacating the h1 square to improve king safety, especially in light of black's active queenside initiative and the potential for a subsequent pawn push or piece infiltration. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to reinforce the kingside defense and potentially prepare for counterplay along the g-file. This move, rg1, repositions the rook to a more active square on the g-file, potentially supporting an attack on black's kingside or preparing to contest the open g-file. This move prepares to contest the open g-file, seeking to challenge white's rook and potentially launch an attack on the kingside. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to support a potential pawn push on the kingside and increase pressure along the third rank. This move is a defensive maneuver to protect the f4 pawn and simultaneously prepare to bring the rook to a more active square, potentially supporting an attack on white's kingside or defending against threats along the 7th rank. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially targeting black's kingside and preparing for future pawn breaks or exchanges. Black continues to reposition his rook, aiming to activate it on the g-file and support potential pawn pushes on the kingside. This move weakens white's kingside pawn structure, opening critical lines for black's pieces to exploit, particularly the rook on g7, which can now target the g-file. The move 25, rhg7, is a defensive repositioning, aiming to safeguard the vulnerable g7 pawn while potentially preparing to double rooks on the g-file. But it concedes central control and allows white further development. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the kingside and potentially preparing to support further pawn advances or coordinate with the rooks. This move is a prophylaxis, aiming to prevent white's potential queenside expansion with b4 and a subsequent advance of the b-pawn. This move prepares to challenge the queenside pawn structure and create potential weaknesses or open lines for the rooks. This move prepares to challenge white's queenside pawn expansion and potentially open the b-file. For black's rook, the move qf1 is a strategic repositioning, aiming to connect the rooks and potentially support a pawn push on the kingside or center, while also keeping an eye on the d5 pawn and the kingside defense. This move repositions the knight to an active square, aiming to exploit the open g-file or potentially support a kingside expansion while also eyeing the weak light squares around white's king. This aggressive pawn push creates immediate tension on the kingside and aims to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king, potentially opening lines for white's attacking pieces. This knight check is a desperate attempt to create complications and disrupt white's control, but it overlooks the critical tactical response that will lead to a winning advantage for white. This move is a necessary tactical concession to neutralize black's initiative on the kingside and prevent further material loss after the knight's unexpected check. This captures the pawn and opens the f-file for black's rook, creating attacking possibilities against white's king. This move recaptures the pawn and centralizes the rook, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and open lines for attack. This move, 31, bf4, aims to activate the bishop, placing it on a more dynamic diagonal and potentially challenging white's control of the f-file, which has become quite open after the recent exchanges. This move activates the rook on f3, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king, specifically targeting the now exposed g-file and potentially setting up pressure on the f4 pawn. This move initiates a dynamic counterattack, bringing the knight to a more active central square and threatening the f2 pawn, aiming to disrupt white's attacking structure. This move repositions the rook to a more active file and defends the g4 pawn, a logical follow-up to the previous exchange and reinforcement of the kingside. This move activates the queen, targeting the weak pawn on g3 and preparing to exploit the open g-file, while simultaneously creating defensive possibilities for the knight on h4. The queen repositions to the f2 square, intending to support a potential advance of the g-pawn to g5, which would create dynamic counterplay on the kingside by exploiting the weakened light squares around black's king. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, supporting the advanced knight and potentially preparing to challenge white's queenside majority or Exploit the weakened dark squares around white's king. This move repositions the bishop to an active square, threatening to exchange on g7 and potentially create new attacking opportunities on the kingside if black's defenders are forced away. This move sacrifices the knight, aiming to open lines against white's king and create attacking chances. But it must be carefully calculated for tactical and positional consequences. This knight move aims to redeploy the knight from the potentially awkward c3 square to a more active central position, supporting the kingside attack and preparing for potential central breaks or maneuvers. The knight repositions to a more active square, eyeing the weak f4 pawn and potentially supporting a future attack on the kingside or a maneuver to the d7 square. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure the black king and potentially support a future pawn push on the kingside. The move 37, bg5 re-establishes an active bishop on the g5 square, which can potentially target the f4 pawn or create tactical opportunities by exploiting the open diagonal. This move aims to create weaknesses on the queenside, potentially forcing black to defend against pawn pushes and limiting the mobility of their pieces. Capturing the pawn opens the b-file, creating potential counterplay for black against white's queenside pawns and allowing the rook to become more active. White aims to exploit the weak dark squares on black's kingside and potentially create attacking opportunities by repositioning the rook to control the a-file, aiming for further pawn breaks or piece activity. The knight's retreat to h4 aims to regroup and potentially attack the white queen on e1 or the weakened g4 square, seeking active counterplay while white solidifies their position. The move rxa5 aims to exploit the newly opened queenside and gain material by targeting the weak pawn on a5, while simultaneously improving the rook's activity. The knight captures the bishop on f5, disrupting white's powerful central control and opening a path for black's own pieces to become more active. This pawn capture on f5 opens up the g-file for potential future action and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure while activating white's rook. The knight on h4 is well placed, aiming to disrupt white's kingside and potentially exploit the weakened light squares around the white king. The queen repositions to e3, defending the g3 pawn and preparing to potentially bring the rook to the g-file for further pressure, while keeping an eye on any potential counterplay black might generate on the kingside. The queen repositions to the 5th rank, aiming to pressure white's kingside and exploit the potential weakness on g3, while also preparing to support potential pawn advances on the queenside. This move re-centralizes the queen to a more active square, aiming to support the kingside pawns and prepare for potential pawn pushes or tactical skirmishes on the kingside, while also keeping an eye on the central squares. The black queen repositions to h6, aiming to connect with the knight on g6 and potentially challenge white's control of the g-file, while also preparing to retreat if attacked. The rook on a1, after recapturing the pawn, aims to reposition along the 1st rank, potentially to support the king's defense or to contest the open a-file if black decides to advance their queenside pawns. Black attempts to reposition the rook to a more active square, eyeing the g-file and potentially supporting a future kingside attack after the recent pawn advances.